If you want to level up your seed starting game from this to this, then this is the only video you need to watch this season. Seed starting is, for me personally, one of my favorite activities because you get to take something literally from its seed to transplant to harvest and enjoy it. So you participate in the whole growing process. But for a lot of gardeners, it's intimidating, it's confusing, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So this video is going to be a complete guide. Everything you need to know, from the basics of what materials do you even need to start seeds, to seed-specific tips, tomatoes versus basil versus peas. There are some differences there, as well as things you can do to boost your seedlings' growth while they're in the starting phase so you have a better harvest. But I have already grown seedlings here. That's a little bit too far in the future. Let's go back in time to selecting your seed varieties as well as the materials you'll need. So what are the bare bones materials you need to get seed started? Of course, seed, and we'll go into choosing varieties in a bit, but of course you need the seed. Next up, you need some kind of tray. You can go really budget here with plastic solo cups or toilet paper rolls or whatever jars you have lying around the house, or you can invest in trays. Of course, we have our Epic trays, Epic 6 cells, 16 4 cells, as well as the 1020 bottom tray that holds all the water, which we'll get into. We love it, but of course you can use whatever you want. Now, the other thing I think that is mandatory that a lot of people will say you can get away with not having is some kind of grow light. The thing about starting seeds is the biggest problem people run into is they simply do not provide the seedlings with enough light. Your seedlings will get long and spindly. It's something called etiolation, or stretching towards the light, which will make them very weak when it comes time to plant them out. And so I do recommend investing in a proper grow light. This one right here can do quite a bit of output. Seedlings do not see light. They use light to photosynthesize. So you need to be putting out literally enough light so that the seed gets everything that it needs to grow. Next up, you'll need some kind of what's called growing medium. A lot of people will think, oh, just any sort of soil or dirt will do. In seed starting, that's really not the case. So for growing medium, there's a couple rules of thumb. The most important one is you need a mixture that does not have a lot of large particles. You can see this mixture here. There's no big chunks of rock. There's no big chunks of bark, anything like that. It's very uniform and it's very fine. The reason why that's important is seedlings need to adhere to that soil. That root needs to come out, get stuck in the soil, really start to develop these side roots and build its root structure before it gets into the ground. It's not gonna be able to do that if there's a big chunk of something blocking it or causing perhaps a pocket of air in there. And so getting a nice fine mix is great. There's a couple ways you can do that. Of course, you can just buy a seed starting mix, but if you want to go a little more budget, you can grab any potting mix that you've got lying around the house and just filter it through about a 1/4 inch screen or so. That's what we do a lot of the time to get our soil prepared. But of course, you can also buy a seed starting mix. Now, the next part where you can go wrong in seed starting with regards to actually just getting these trays filled. This will make a big difference in your seed starting results. Trust me. You could do something like this, where you grab your seed starting mix and you just kind of dump it in like this. And the second it gets up to the top, you say, okay, I'm done, right? Well, watch what happens when I do this. I just dropped the level by about 1/2 inch or so, which means that there's a lot more soil that I could put in this tray. And not only that, because this is a light and fluffy mix, which is what we want, it's going to have a little bit of ability to compress, which you kind of want to do. So what I like to do is make sure that this is pre-moistened, by the way. You don't want to put super dry mixture in here. You want it to have some amount of water, not sopping wet, but not bone dry. Close to if you were to grab a damp towel or a very well squeezed out sponge. You want that kind of amount of moisture in there. And then what I'll do is I'll take another tray of some kind and I'll compress it down just a little bit. What that does is it makes it so that not only can I put the seedling in and have a little more ability to cover it up later, which I'll show you, but also it just compresses that soil just enough so the roots can really set in. So we have everything we need to actually get our seeds into the seedling mix that we just prepared. Now, this is where it can start to feel intimidating. How do you know how to plant each seed? Well, it turns out that on the back of almost any seed packet that exists, certainly ours at Botanical Interests, there's all the info you could ever need. Now, You don't have to follow it. There's a little bit of looseness to some of these rules, but I'll go through some general rules of thumb here as we plant out a variety of vegetables that you're probably going to be growing this year. And we'll start it off with a couple of these tomatoes. So we'll kick it off with Cherokee Purple, pretty classic tomato variety. Now, the way that you get seeds into your trays is close to the same for every plant, but I do want to talk about some of the more popular varieties just because it's going to help you as you get into the actual gardening once these start to sprout. So there's a couple ways you can do it. I personally am a fan of just making a slight depression. I'm using the backside of one of our garden markers here. You can use a pencil, you can use your finger, it doesn't really matter. And you just want to depress it very slightly. And what we're gonna do, and this is pretty crucial, is it's 2 seeds per hole in almost all cases. There's one variety here I'm gonna talk about that violates that rule. But if you think about it, all seeds have what's called a germination rate. And it's dependent on a couple different things. Number one, it's the species of the actual plant. Some plants, the seeds just have a better germination rate than other plants. But then of course, it's also the quality of the seed, and it's also the age of that seed. So there's a lot of different factors that can affect the germination rate, which is just the rate at which a seed will successfully sprout. Now, what you have to keep in mind here is, let's just say there's a 90% chance of germination for these Cherokee Purple tomatoes that I just put in. If I was to plant 100 of those seeds, well, on average, 90 would sprout and 10 wouldn't, right? But imagine instead if I planted 2 seeds per cell in 100 cells. Now what's gonna happen is that germination rate is gonna be applied twice. So it's going to be a 99% germination rate, or you should expect only one of those seeds to not sprout. So long way of saying, putting 2, maybe 3, if you feel like it's old seed, into a hole is going to pretty much guarantee that something sprouts, provided you didn't do something wrong, which I'm gonna help you avoid. Next one I wanna show you is an onion, a fantastic crop to grow. Pretty cheap at the grocery store, but honestly, a homegrown onion, extremely satisfying to pull out of the ground. And also, in my opinion, a little bit tastier. So this variety is called Yellow Gran X. Now, the thing with onions is you can plant 2 or 3 seeds per hole, but you can even let those continue to grow once they've sprouted for a few reasons. The first is, if you want to grow them as green onions, well then you can just plant them as a bunch. It's not a big deal. Or if you want to grow them as bulbing onions, what they'll start to do is, as they grow up and start to bulb out, they'll kind of press away from each other, and you can pull those onions out and it'll let the other ones continue to grow. It's a process called multi-sowing. So you don't actually have to do something I'll show you later called thinning out for onions if you don't want to. So we're moving on now to spaghetti squash, or really you could apply these tips to cucumbers, beans, peas, a lot of those kinds of crops with large seeds. Now, I mean, take a look. You can see these, they're quite large. There's a couple different ways you want to approach starting a seed like this. First of all, I would recommend, instead of using a smaller tray like this, these are our 6-cell trays, or certainly a 16-cell or whatever you're using at home, I would go with a larger tray or a larger container, maybe a red Solo cup. I'd put 1 squash in there. Why? It's because this plant doesn't really want to compete too much with other plants, as well as the fact that it doesn't really want to be potted up too many times. You wouldn't want to take it from a 6-cell into a 4-cell or a 6-cell into a larger pot, because it's pretty sensitive when it comes to the structure of the roots. So the way that I would do this is, first of all, you're going to notice on a squash or a lot of these seeds, there's going to be a pointy side and a more blunted or dull side. You want to put it pointy side up. That's where that sprout is going to come out. The root is then going to come out of the bottom, and you're going to get a little bit quicker germination because the plant's not going to have to reorient itself. Now, when you're planting a seed like this, they're so big, how are you actually supposed to, you just do that? No, that's not gonna work. What you wanna do, and this is a general rule of thumb for all seeds, is you wanna plant it about twice as deep as it is wide. So I would say this is about 1/4 of an inch wide. I'm gonna go at least a 1/2 inch deep, and I'm gonna just kind of slide it in like that, pointy side up. Of course, you can do 2 if you want. Sometimes the bigger seeds are a little bit easier to germinate, and if I'm trying to conserve seed, I may just use 1. But for the purposes of this, especially if you're a beginner, I think it's good to overseed just slightly so you know you get something when it comes time to transplant and of course eventually harvest. So in these are going to develop entirely in the 4-cell, or basically the larger tray. And then when it comes time to transplant, it'll be a lot easier to get that soil and that sort of plant plug, as it's called, soil, roots, and plant, into the garden. Now we have a plant that violates the plant more than one seed in a hole rule, and that would be beets. This is the gourmet blend beet, so there's a couple different varieties in this packet here. But the thing about beets is the seed is what's called a compound seed. So that means that planting one beet seed is actually planting more than one beet seed. It just looks like one when you hold it in your hand. So I'm gonna make 16 depressions here. Now the reason you would use something like a 16 cell or just plant a lot more beets is because you only get one beet per beet. When you're talking about tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash, one seed will produce many, many tomatoes, peppers, and squash, whereas one beet is just gonna produce one beet. So what's nice is I'm gonna put this in a 16 cell. Now I know I have at least 16 beets that I can harvest when it comes ready to go. And these will end up sprouting more than one, even though I'm only putting what looks to be one seed in here. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, another thing you can do with beets specifically, kind of like the onions, is this is almost its own version of what I just told you about with the onions, multi-sowing. There's gonna be more than one coming up. I can let those continue to grow, especially out in the garden, and start harvesting off the smaller ones and letting the larger ones continue to size up, so I can get maybe a baby beet, I can get a mid-sized beet, and of course, if there's like 2 or 3 sprouts together, I can get a much larger, more mature beet as I pull off those ones that grow right next to one another. And as I do this, the one thing you're seeing me do on all these varieties is use a label. I cannot tell you how helpful this tip is. You will simply not remember what time you planted it, what plant it is, unless you use a label. So what we'll do is, at the very bare minimum, you want to put the variety and the species on here. So this is dill, but it's bouquet dill. And for extra credit, we will also write down today's date so I know when I started them, and those are going to go right in to the cell. So depending on what container you have, of course, you can use different kinds of labels. These ones are designed to perfectly fit in our Epic 6 cells, and they're made of super durable plastic, so you use them year after year after year. A lot of the times these ones are a little bit flimsier, and they'll actually go kind of brittle, and they'll break, and you throw them away every single year. So we wanted to make something that you could use. But let's get into starting a couple herbs, which again have a bit of a different flavor. And that's why I really want to hammer on all these different techniques, because if you look at a dill, like I said, this is bouquet dill, this has a totally different way that it wants to be started. First of all, it is a slow germinator, or it takes a long time to start sprouting. It's 20 to 25 days. Most of the stuff you've seen me talk about here is maybe 5 to 14 days or so. This is almost up to a month, and if you look at the back of a packet, it'll tell you seed depth, press into surface. This is one of those unique cases where a seed does not want to be buried. It wants to, and I'll show you exactly how we like to do this. You'll just take the seed, and you'll come in right on the surface here, drop a couple down. You can still do, a few per cell, especially with something like an herb, because it's not such a big deal if they grow right next to one another. And all you want to do is just adhere it to the soil. I use the back of my finger because my nail doesn't pull the seed back up. I'll just kind of do that. And then once we get to watering, you'll see the way that we approach that. But that just makes it so much easier to grow this plant. Herbs can be a bit tricky for a lot of beginner gardeners. I'll take another example. This is long-standing Santo. This is a cilantro variety. This one takes 10 to 15 days, and it wants to be about a ½ inch deep. And so it kind of violates that rule I was telling you about, where you want to plant it about twice as deep as it is wide, because it's really not that big of a seed. You can tell it's very small, almost looks like a very miniature tomatillo of sorts. But what's special about the cilantro is when you crunch that seed, or what looks to be the seed, you discover that the cilantro seed is actually inside this tiny little ball. And so the way that we've found, specific to cilantro, to get this to germinate a little bit quicker is you'll make your depressions, and instead of just dropping these little cilantro balls in, what you'll do is you'll come through, grab 2, crunch them a little bit between your fingers. You want to hear a little bit of a crunch. And what that does is it just cracks that hull a little bit and allows moisture to get in there a little quicker. You can even kind of dig your nail in slightly and drop it, this can speed up that 10 to 15 day germination to maybe even 8 days or so, which is great. And there's a couple other techniques I'll share with you on how to speed up germination, because one of these techniques works no matter what you're planting. So next up, we have probably one of the most popular herbs in the entire world. This is a basil. This variety specifically is Italian Genovese, one of the more common ones. Now, basil is a tricky one because it can take a while to germinate. Back in my microgreen growing days, or growing a bunch of baby greens and selling to restaurants, basil was a very popular microgreen, and it would always take a lot longer. And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, the seed is absolutely tiny. It's very small, not quite as small as some of those flower seeds you might see out there, but nevertheless, it's pretty small, about a fourth of the size even of a dill seed, which isn't that big. Now, what you want to do with basil, it goes about 1/4 of an inch deep, and it has this unique property. It's called a mucilaginous coating, which another word to say is once it gets wet, it forms a gel around itself. And that helps it get enough moisture into that seed to start germinating. But basil, you'll find, just takes a little bit longer than everything else. Your tomatoes might be up, your squash might be up, your peas might be up, and the basil looks like it hasn't sprouted. And that's probably because it actually hasn't. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's dead. You just need to make sure to keep that basil nice and moist. And it's not the end of the world if you put 2 to 4 basil seeds, because you can grow it more as a bunch instead of a single plant. Both are acceptable, but a lot of people will grow it as a bunch. So the last plant-specific seed starting tip I have for you right now is a bean or a pea. It's an easy plant to start. I mean, take a look at the seed. They're absolutely massive. And of course, for this crop, that's the part of the plant that we eat. When we eat a tomato, we're eating the fruit, or the fruiting body of that plant, the tomato. When we eat a bean, we're just eating the seed itself. So it's a very familiar looking seed to us, and of course, very large. Now, a lot of people will say for things like the beets you saw us transplant, for peas, for poppies, for some sorts of herbs, and especially for beans and peas, they'll say don't even bother starting them indoors. Start them exactly where you want to grow them in the garden, a process called direct sowing. You can definitely do that. And I would say that if you've got the temperatures for it, then there's nothing wrong with that. But we found that it's not that big a deal to transplant them. In fact, we've had great success with it. And the reason why people say that it's not a good idea to transplant them is because a lot of these plants have what are called sensitive taproots. So they have sort of one major root coming down, and that root, if disturbed, really will mess up the performance of the entire plant, which means you'll kill it if you transplant it. Well, we've sort of fixed that, and I'll show you how we did it so you can kind of transplant anything. So here are some bean seeds right here. These are sprouted, of course. Now, if I was to just like rip this out, or if I didn't have something on the bottom, it would be very difficult to get this out without damaging the plant. But what I can do here, because there's these very large bottom holes on our trays, is I can just put my finger right up underneath and very gently pull this out. And as you can see, there's absolutely no root disturbance here. And then I can very gently transplant this, which I'll show you a bit later, and you have no problems growing something that you're not supposed to start indoors. So our trays are fully seeded out, and we're done, right? No, there's a lot more to do here to make sure your seeds are set up for success. So the first thing you want to do is apply some water to the top, but it should be a gentle spray. Maybe a shower on the hose nozzle. I prefer actually a mist. I'll come through and just do a mist or use a spray bottle. What that does is it helps to adhere the seeds, especially if they're like that dill, that surface sown dill, to the soil. Gets them nice and sticky, and of course, gets them wet because they need to be to trigger the signal to germinate or to sprout. The next thing I might do as soon as sprouting starts to happen, and this is the way I water there on out, is what's called bottom watering. So I'll have a little container like this, or I might have a hose, and I'll just lift up one of these to show you. What I'll come in and do is drop some water in, maybe about a ½ inch or so. Let it permeate throughout the entire tray. So I'm kind of looking here, and it's making its way all the way down. And then I'll just put this right back. And because hopefully any container you're using has some kind of drainage ability at the bottom, water is going to do what's called wick up. There's a process called capillary action, which will pull water from a wetter medium to a drier medium, meaning that if this entire thing is equally moist, it'll actually pull upwards, the water, kind of counteracting gravity, which is a really great way to water because then you're not disturbing the soil and you're also not kind of spraying over the top of sensitive seedlings. Now, when it comes to lighting, unless a seed needs light to germinate, which some flowers do, definitely some things that are surface sown do, you don't really need a light at the beginning of the process. I like to have one because it's just a good habit. I don't have to think about putting the light in place once I start to see little sprouts come up. But the thing about lighting that's the most important, especially at the beginning, but really throughout an entire seedling's life, is the distance that this light is. So I'm gonna crank this up to max because it really is going to want that much light. This is my maximum light. And what I'll do is I will move this down. We have these retractable legs on our light. If you don't have one, you can do like a chain or something like that, or a pulley system. You wanna get it as close as you possibly can to the surface of the soil. And what you're looking to do here is just provide those seedlings with as much light as possible without doing something called burning them. It can literally burn them. The heat can be so much coming off of these. These are LEDs, so it probably wouldn't happen, but depending on the light you have, you can actually singe the seedlings, or you can just provide so much light that they don't respond favorably. And then as you see that happen, maybe it's a little too close, you can start to pull this light up. And of course, as the seedlings grow, you'll also want to pull this light up as well. So we're gonna put this back down on a lower output just for now. But the thing that you're wondering is, how long do I leave the light on? If you think about out in nature, if you were starting these seeds, it would just be as long as the day is. So sunrise to sunset, and of course, more intense in the middle of the day. Because we're using a grow light here, you really can set it to whatever you want. I would say 8 hours is a minimum. On this particular light, what we've done is we have an 8, 12, and 16-hour preset you can just click to. I think it's a really good idea to go to 16. So I'm always on 16, and unless I'm seeing overly stressed plants, I'm always hitting it with the maximum amount of light possible. And usually I'd keep it on that setting and just move it further away rather than turn the setting down a little bit. But that's the key you have to understand about lighting and starting your seeds. Now, this piece of gear right here is not mandatory, but if you're in cold climates, maybe you're doing this in Minnesota in the winter, you might want to consider a heat mat. The reason why is because seedlings are primarily triggered to sprout by the existence of moisture, the absence usually of light, and some minimum temperature. If you're not getting temperatures above, I would say at least 65 Fahrenheit, if not 70 Fahrenheit or more, you might still get sprouting, but they will take some time to get started. For example, if the soil in these seed starting cells here, where I've planted my tomatoes, was at about 60 Fahrenheit, it would take about 15 days for that tomato to sprout. Whereas if it was north of 70 Fahrenheit, that tomato would sprout in about half the time, about 7 to 9 days. So you can speed up your germination a lot by providing the plant the heat that it needs. One way to do that is with a heat mat. And then the next question is, okay, well, when do I turn the heat mat off? And it's really just when most of these have sprouted. After that, the heat is not as important. So if you've done everything right up to this point, you should have some seedlings in your trays now. And there are some things you can do to really increase their vigor or their ability to kind of grow well and withstand a lot of the conditions that you're gonna put them out in the garden. So there's a couple things to notice here. First of all, of course, they all look different. These plants are growing in different ways, but something that you will notice on almost every plant is the existence of what are called seed leaves. They do not look like the leaf you see right here. So take a look at this squash, for example. You see these two leaves right here are very ovate in their shape. They're just like big ovals, whereas the actual squash leaf, also known as the true leaf, is very different in its shape. So the first leaves a plant is gonna put out are called the seed leaves. It's a good sign, of course. It means that they're sprouting, but it's not really the point at which you would want to transplant. You still want to grow these plants out a little bit more, but it is a good point to apply some pressure to your seedlings. And of course, what I'm talking about there is, imagine a seedling out in the wild. You're a little basil sprout in the garden, and you're just coming up naturally. I'm very much visualizing this. What's gonna be happening? Well, the environment's going to be happening to you. It's sort of exerting its forces on you. And what one of those things is wind. There's gonna be some level of movement caused by the wind that's pushing these plants around. And what that will do is it will create an adaptive response in the plant. In almost all plants, what it's gonna do is, it's kind of a crazy word, but it's called thigmomorphogenesis. It's going to adapt by becoming a little bit more sturdy, a little bit more strong. And that means that when you do put it out in the garden, it's going to withstand a little bit more of the weather and the different environmental conditions that could go in. So the way to do that indoors is to take an oscillating fan as soon as you start to see those seed leaves coming up on your seedlings, and just have an oscillating fan blowing over it for about 6 to 8 hours a day. You can even set it on a timer where it starts and stops randomly, but we just like to put an oscillating fan on. Make sure it's close enough that it's getting to the entire tray of seedlings, but not so powerful that it's going to be dehydrating the soil, because effectively blowing air over a moist surface is something called evaporative cooling. It's going to actually pull the water out of the soil. So if you do this, you may have to water a little more frequently, but you will have much sturdier and stronger seedlings. So those seed leaves, why do they even exist? Well, when a plant starts its life, it doesn't have much in the way of a root system, which means it doesn't have an ability to feed itself. So the seed leaves exist within the seed to basically give a little booster pack to that seed as it starts to sprout. It's effectively the initial food source. So after about 2 weeks or so, the plant has kind of used up that food source, and you'll start to see leaves like these squash seed leaves kind of go yellow or brown, curl, get a little bit withered. It's that they're dying, but it's mostly that the plant is using them for energy. So what you'll need to do at about the 2-week mark is fertilize. And the best way we've found to do this is with a very dilute liquid organic fertilizer. So if I look at the back of this Grow Big liquid fertilizer from Fox Farm, and I look for the seedling labeling, it says 1/2 teaspoon per gallon once per week. Now you can follow that exactly, and if you're beginning, I do recommend it. The way I like to do it is I'll take about a capful. So I'll just kind of pour a capful in like this, and then I will very carefully not spill it and put it into my watering can, just like that. I'll shake it up a little bit, and then after the 2-week mark or so, every single time I water, which is probably once every 2 or 3 days, depending on how moist the soil still is, I will lift the tray out and I will water it like this with liquid organic fertilizer. When you go to a nursery and you go, oh my gosh, how are the nursery seedlings so much better than mine? How are they so much stronger? They're being fertilized, and they're being fertilized pretty aggressively. And so that is really the checklist to get your seedlings up to the point where you need to transplant them. But before you transplant them, you need to make sure they're ready to get out there in your garden. So far, I've given you everything you need to know to baby your seedlings. Basically, these have been pampered, they've been treated like absolute kings and queens, and what that means is they might be a little bit spoiled. If you were to go toss them in the garden, especially early in the season, they might just get shocked and immediately die. It's called transplant shock, and it can happen to pretty much any plant you see underneath here. The way to solve that is a process called hardening off. Now, if you've kept them in this sort of perfect, idyllic environment indoors, and you just pop them outside, they're gonna die. So what you need to do is for about a week, you will take them out into a garden area, maybe just your back porch or somewhere close to the conditions where you'd plant it. Maybe do 2 hours, then bring it back in. Next day, 3 hours, bring it back in. Next day, 5 hours, bring it back in, until it gets to the point where it's about 8 to 10 hours outside. That will condition or harden off these seedlings so that you can actually transplant them successfully. Now, there are some seedlings that you wouldn't want to transplant immediately. Something like a squash, you're gonna be putting that directly out in the garden as soon as it gets to, I would say, 3 or 4 sets of these true leaves. So these ones aren't quite there yet. I see 1 and then 2 true leaves here. So I need this to basically double the amount of leaves before I'm comfortable putting it outside. But something like a tomato, a pepper, an eggplant, these are plants that not only take a while to sprout, but also need to kind of grow up a little more before they get out in the garden. If I was to put a tomato seedling out that looks like this one just has a couple little seed leaves and almost barely anything, it really would not do well. There would be almost no point to have started it indoors. I should have just thrown some seeds in the ground. What you want to do for these is a process called potting up. So what you'll do is you'll take a cell like this is our 6 cell, you'd pop it out, and then you would put it into a larger pot. Why? Because it's starting to get what's called root bound in the smaller cell. The roots are growing so much that they're actually crowding the plant out. And you know what I'm talking about when you go to the nursery and you pull out maybe a bean seedling that you bought and it's just pure white roots in the shape of the pot container. That is a root bound seedling. Roots in nature, at least, do not want to do that. They want to kind of spread out in this sort of upside down funnel shape underneath the soil. So potting up allows you to do that without having to transplant into the soil yet. So for something like tomatoes, peppers, you might take it from a 6-cell to a 4-cell, or you might take it from a 6-cell to a small 3 or 5-inch pot, let it grow, and then do that hardening off period and get it out into the garden. So what we've done is gone through exactly what you need to start seeds successfully. However, even if you follow these tips, sometimes things can go wrong. So we have a video right here that goes over the most common seed starting mistakes to avoid. And of course, everything you see in this video, the seeds, the light, the trays, are all available at shop.epicgardening.com. We think we've put together the best seed starting system on the market, which means that you have better harvests, better yields, and a happier garden. We'll see you on the next one. Good luck in the garden and keep on growing.